Back in my days of being a 12-year-old loser, as opposed to an 18-year-old loser, I was interested in drawing one thing: female faces. I wasn't interested in any anime, wasn't interested in drawing boobs. I was only interested in making awful looking female portraits. Why? Probably because I was a prepubescent boy obsessed with pretty girls.
Which would later make me draw half-naked women.
But the reason you should pay attention to is that it is arguably the most important part of an illustration. You see, faces serve as an emotion projector. They are what the viewer empathizes with when looking at a character piece. It is what humanizes a character. Besides, drawing pretty girls is just pleasant and gets a lot of likes, right? This shit ain't adding up. Okay, maybe you shouldn't draw girls just for the purpose of getting likes. Nonetheless, whether it is a Pinterest girl or an academic portrait, drawing the female face is S tier in the what to draw next tier list. But since the face is incredibly complex, I figured it would be good to break it down into simpler steps. That way you can actually learn how to draw a female face without constantly wondering if you just accidentally gave your character a landing strip of a forehead or made her look like a muddy mess of colors. If that sounds interesting to you, let's get into it, shall we? Hey, I'm Diego, also known as the least reliable person in the world, and I'm here to show you how, although you see close to 3 million faces in your lifetime, you probably still can't do a backflip. Now, like any attention-loving video maker, I want to relate to you that I post more of my content that I don't forget about on my Instagram and Twitter. And if I somehow grow a responsible bone in my body, we'll also soon start back up my stream on Twitch. Now, what you do with that information is of course completely up to you, but if you like to see an 18-year-old struggle to make art, I'm sure you'll have a blast by clicking the little follow icon on all those three. So let's get into what you came here for. How do you draw a female face? Well, let's break that problem down into a few digestible steps you can take to make any female portrait look the best it can. Starting with the first step, research. Or as known by most people, reference hunting. Nobody likes this step, but it isn't one that you can really skip. I've highlighted this in most of my previous videos, but if you want to make any sort of believable art piece as a beginner or intermediate artist, you're going to need to reference things that exist. So how do you find reference? It's actually pretty easy in concept, but in practice it is the reason I dread drawing and painting without already having a reference. I personally use both Instagram and Pinterest to find the reference that I use in my images. Since I'm really picky with reference, I typically use Pinterest to get a wide array of choices on demand and use Instagram to more so casually find reference as I peek at my feed. I also use Instagram for most of my figure reference since Pinterest does not have booty. So I ended up picking this reference for my pins. It has a nice vibe that can probably translate well to the type of portrait I'm making. Now, this portion is optional, but I recommend it if you are stuck in a rut with how you want to stylize your portraits. And that is an inspiration board. Find a few artists that you enjoy and want to emulate and toss them into a board you can reference. This is always helpful, as whenever you feel a bit lost, you can look over and get inspired by these. I actually went with a few Samuel Yun references, since I want to emulate his style to showcase some more extreme stylization of the face. But I'll try my best to make this tutorial apply to all female faces rather than just stylized ones. Now that you have built up a decent chunk of reference to use, you can finally open up your art program of choice and get to work with the next step, the rough sketch. The rough sketch is a pretty daunting thing to do, as it is the most uncertain portion of the process. But you'll get through it, I think. This is the place where your goopy, stinky artist brain gets to work. You'll be figuring out longitudes, you'll be figuring out latitudes, a squared plus b squared equals c squared type shit. If your brain doesn't start throbbing out of your head, you're doing it wrong. Here's how I did my rough sketch. First, I started by roughing out some proportions. There's a lot of ways to do this, but I personally prefer to be really loose in this stage. So I typically opt for just placing the eye line, which should be halfway between the bottom of the chin and the top of the head, followed by the eyes, about an eye width apart, always doing both of them at the same time rather than one at a time. I then estimate where the nose and mouth would be by mentally dividing the lower half into thirds and placing them both accordingly. This is where the features generally reside on the face. Next, once I have finished this extremely rough and ugly ass sketch, I'll get into making it look a bit more confident and clean so it can be a bit more readable and come through better when I paint the piece. Now, when I say a little, I mean a little, because believe me, it still looked like shit by the time I finished the small cleanup. I make a different layer and lower the opacity of the last sketch by a little bit. Now, this isn't line art, so I'm not planning to delete the original sketch. But I'm using this next layer as a way to add a bit more structure to the original sketch, as well as shape it to be less ambiguous and more informational. This is pretty much the heavy lifting. Unless you're like me and are
Perpetually afraid of colors and painting because it feels like you always fuck up your pieces by knowing nothing about color theory but also postponing learning more because it's too hard.
then you're shit out of luck. This is the first pit stop of the tutorial, as you can actually take this and clean it up as much as you want, maybe even slightly shade it and call it done. So if this is all you wanted to do,
Hey, get the fuck out of here.
next, the painting of the face. Fuck do I suck at this. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. I kind of went really easy on the colors I used and kept it very simple since I am a textbook pussy. And having been trying to read Pride and Prejudice for school, I could not take any more frustration. So, if you want me to really study up and give you a more complex and complete skin painting tutorial, drop it in the comments. I'll see what I can do. Anyways, going back to the painting, I'm grabbing the mid-tone and picking a slightly darker, more saturated color, as well as making it more red in order to lift the shadows a bit. You'll notice I'm painting the big shadow shapes so I can really get an idea of the form of the face. Also go in with a slightly more desaturated and more yellow lighter color for the light portions. It doesn't look too pretty, but I'm getting a bit of an idea of what to do. You'll also notice that I use things like hue saturation and color balance layers to spice my color choice up a bit, since I want the painting to breathe a bit more life instead of looking so muddy. I take the lines to a really saturated red and begin laying out colors and information I need to detail it further. Now, you of course are more likely a better painter than I am, so you of course know that getting your colors in is really just half the battle. Enter the detailing stage, also known as the rendering stage. Here, you'll want to really get in there and flesh out your painting. You'll blend out things that need blending, suggest some more plain changes, and get overall really into the painting. This is also what I like to call the mindless stage, as while for me it still throbs my brain to do it, for most other artists, this is when you pretty much have all the colors mostly laid out, and you are just prettying them up so they can look nice and appealing. So, here's typically where you can just turn on a podcast or some music and get lost for a few hours before returning to Earth with something probably way worse than what you originally set out to do. You're probably wondering what you should do now that you just wasted all this time and your colors still don't look good. This is actually a step most artists don't really touch on when talking about how they make their digital art pop. And if you aren't familiar with color correcting and editing things within your program, you're probably completely clueless as to what this is. Of course, I'm talking to the savior that is post-processing. This is when you add all those sweet effects and filters to your art to make it look better. Here, you'll want to assess what you think your art needs. Is it too muddy? Try using a hue saturation layer and bumping up that saturation. Are you a bit unhappy with your palette overall? Try using a color balance layer and play with the colors. Feel your piece needs to pop a bit more? Use a curves or levels layer to help you with the contrast of your piece. There's tons of stuff you can do here. But in the interest of time, I'll let you play around a bit with it and figure out what works for you through some experimentation. And that's pretty much it. You should now be able to add some structure to your pretty girl portraits by using rough sketching, cleanup, color blocking, detailing, and post-processing steps. Hopefully you got something out of this tutorial, which now looking at this in written form looks like a clusterfuck of vague statements and not much teaching. But y'all asked for it. Y'all knew damn well Diego sucks at drawing and painting and still thought this shit was a good idea. Nah, but for real, painting faces is pretty complex. There's a lot of subtlety in it that I simply can't get into in the interest of time, that you'll be exploring and figuring out as you draw and paint more faces. So, to really round this process out, let me add in the step people always forget: practice. Remember that this thing you're hearing from your device should really only be your launchpad. You're not going to learn much about drawing faces by just watching videos if you aren't putting pen to paper and scribbling some out yourself. Get used to the idea that you won't get things right the first time, and that generally you'll also be teaching yourself quite a bit, because as much as I'd want to, I can't hold your hand throughout the whole process. No, really, I can't. There's a screen, see? So, to wrap this up nicely, I'll just say, try out the method I laid out. Sketch out some faces, maybe paint some of them, and just get used to doing it on a constant basis. Because ultimately, the best teacher for yourself isn't me or the next YouTuber you come across. It's you.
I fall all over the place.